In this video, we continue our discussion on Chapter 9, in which we go over firm price, where in our last video we examined the characteristics of a perfectly competitive market. Now, in this video, we seek to develop a perfectly competitive market in order to examine how the price point for a competitive firm is determined. We will do so by going over some preliminaries in order to go over market structure, market demand, market supply, put those three components together in order to get market equilibrium, from which we will determine the firm price. So, beginning with our preliminaries, in order to examine firm price, we will need the market structure, in which we'll assume perfect competition. Additionally, we will need market demand, which is going to be the sum of product demand for consumers in the market. And lastly, we will need market supply, which is going to be the sum of product supply for firms in the market. In order to proceed, we'll go by example and go through each of our three components as needed, where, in our example, suppose we are considering the market for a crop in which our market is comprised of utility maximizing consumers whom demand the crop, as well as profit maximizing firms whom supply the crop. Beginning with market structure, we will assume that the crop market is perfectly competitive where the following assumptions hold. There are many consumers and firms, where for ease of calculation, in this case, many consumers and firms will mean two consumers and two firms. They are selling the identical product of a crop, in which consumers and firms have perfect information in terms of product demand, product supply, as well as the price point for the overall market. Our market is comprised of profit maximizing firms as well as utility maximizing consumers, in which there's low barriers to entry as well as exit for our firms, and there's going to be zero economic profits. Now proceeding on to market demand, this is going to be the sum of product demand for our two consumers in the market, where product demand is the solution to the consumer problem, where recall that the consumer problem in this case is going to be maximize utility from crops subject to the budget constraint for each of our two consumers, where, for the sake of time, suppose that we derived product demand for our two consumers, where we have product demand for consumer 1, where price is on the vertical axis, crop quantity is going to be on the horizontal axis. We have a downward sloping curve indicating the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded for the good. And we also have an alternative product demand curve for consumer 2, in which price is on the vertical, crop is on the horizontal, and that downward sloping curve indicating that inverse relationship between price and quantity. Now, with this information in mind, in order to construct market demand, we need to sum demand for each of our consumers at each price point, where here we have our graphical representation below in terms of product demand for consumer 1, product demand for consumer 2. Summing those two together, we have market demand for the overall crop market. And in order to construct this, let us look at our table representation, where we have our points for our demand curve. We're given the corresponding price point, quantity demanded for each of our two consumers, and then our sum. So, at point A, at a price point of 20, consumer 1, quantity demanded for crops is 5, while for consumer 2, it's going to be 15. So, at a price point of 20, market demand is going to be 20, which is going to be the sum of 15 and 5. Repeating this process for B, at a price point of 10, consumer 1 has a quantity demanded of 9, while consumer 2 has a quantity demanded of 27. Summing those two together at that price point, we then have that market demand is going to be 36. Repeating for C, at a price point of 5, summing across 11 and 33 for consumer 1 and 2, we arrive at market demand value of 44. Moving on to point D, at a price point of 2.5, consumer 1 has a quantity demanded of 12, while consumer 2 has a quantity demanded of 36. Summing across this, we arrive at the value of 48. And lastly, for point E, at a price point of 2, consumer 1's quantity demanded is 12.5, while consumer 2 is 37.5. Summing across this, we get a value of 50. In this way, given product demand for individual consumers, we can then construct an individual market demand curve, as we just did. Now, with that in mind, let us repeat the process, but from the perspective of market supply, which is going to be the sum of product supply for our two firms in our market, where product supply is going to be the marginal cost curve obtained in the firm problem, where recall that a firm problem is to maximize profits subject to the production constraint, where in this case also suppose that our two crop firms are identical in terms of their production constraint as well as their cost structure, which this isn't too much of an outstretch to think about, in that if there's an identical product that's being sold in a perfectly competitive market, since they are price takers, profits are tending towards zero. It's not uncommon to think that production methods are going to be very similar, as well as the cost structures that these firms face. So then with this information below, with our two identical firms, they'll have two identical marginal cost curves, which translates to our product supply curves. So for firm 1, price on the vertical axis, crop quantity on the horizontal axis, we have our upward sloping marginal cost curve representing product supply, given our positive relationship between price and quantity. And similarly, we have our second product supply curve, which is the marginal cost curve for our second firm, and it is identical to crop supply 1. So then with this information, in order to construct market supply, we will do what we did with product demand in constructing market demand, and just sum quantity for each of our agents at a given price point. And since the marginal cost curves for our both firms are the same, this is just going to be the amount of scaling our quantity by 2 at each price point. So at point A, at a price point of 2, firm 1's quantity supplied is going to be 10, and so is firm's 2. So in terms of the market, at a price point of 2, quantity supplied is going to be 20, while for at point B, at a price point of 2.5, firm 1's quantity supplied is 18. Scaling that by 2, since they're identical, gives us a value of 36. For point C, at a price point of 5, firm 1's quantity supplied is going to be 22. Adding this with firm 2, or just scaling it by 2, gives us a value of 44 in terms of the market. Moving on to point D, at a price point of 10, quantity supplied for firm 1 is going to be 24. Likewise for firm 2, summing those two together gives us a value of 48. And then lastly, with respect to point E, at a price point of 20, firm 1 has quantity supplied at 25, as does firm 2. So summing those two together, or just scaling 25 by 2, we get a value of 50. And then this constructs market supply, where we once again still have that positive relationship between price and quantity. So then, with market demand and market supply constructed, we can then put the two together and we can find the market's equilibrium, where recall that market equilibrium is going to be the intersection of demand and supply such that there's no excess quantity demanded nor excess quantity supplied. Where here we have our graphical representation for the crop market, where price is on the vertical axis, crop is on the horizontal axis. We have our downward sloping crop market demand curve that we derived, inverse relationship between price and quantity, and we have our upward sloping crop market supply curve that's positively sloped given the positive relationship between price and quantity, and this is just the sum of our two marginal cost curves. At the intersection of these two, supply equals demand, we have market equilibrium, giving us the unique price point and unique quantity level compatible with both buyers and sellers in this market. And in order to determine this precisely, we can just turn to our table representation in which we're given the price, market demand value, as well as market supply value. At a price point of 20, market demand is 20, while market supply is 50. Since supply is greater than demand, there's an excess of supply going on in this market. At a price point of 10, market supply is 48, while market demand is 36. This does not constitute equilibrium given that market supply exceeds market demand. At a price point of 5, we see that market supply is 44, and so is market demand. In this case, there's no excess supply and there's no excess demand. So at a price point of 5 and a quantity level of 44 is what's going to constitute market equilibrium for our crop market. And then for the sake of completeness, working through our other 2 points, at a price point of 2, market demand is 48, while market supply is 36. Here we have an excess of demand since demand is greater than supply, and similar for a price point of 2. Market demand is 50, while market supply is 20. Demand is greater than supply, so there's an excess of demand. So once again, to reiterate, our equilibrium price is going to be 5, and our equilibrium quantity level is going to be 44, as this is when buyer and seller behavior are compatible with another in our crop market. So then, with this information in terms of our equilibrium price and quantity level from the market, we can thus recover the marginal revenue curve and equilibrium quantity level for an individual firm in our market as well. So here we have our crop market as before, price on the vertical, crop on the horizontal. The intersection of our downward sloping demand curve and upward sloping supply curve gives us equilibrium, which was at the price point of 5, quantity level of 44. Since this is a perfectly competitive market, firms are price takers, so they take price as a given in what's determined in the market. In the market, we determined that the equilibrium price was $5, so firms price their goods, in this case crops, at $5, and this constitutes as the marginal revenue curve for a firm. And so if we pair this in tandem with the marginal cost curve or the individual product supply curve of a firm, we can then recover equilibrium for an individual firm and go through their profit maximization process as a result. So the intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue is going to give us our profit maximization bundle in terms of output produced, as well as if we had a production function, the amount of variable labor and fixed capital that we'd be using. And this is going to be at a price point of 5. And so we're covering this with our information from the prior slides and just adding in our marginal revenue in terms of our table value. Recovering our intersection between marginal revenue and marginal cost, we see that at 10 crops, marginal revenue is 5, marginal cost is 2. This doesn't correspond. Moving on down, at crop value of 18, marginal revenue is 5, while marginal cost is 2.5. This wouldn't be our profit maximizing bundle. With crops being produced at 22, marginal revenue, marginal cost are compatible with another. So then our profit maximizing bundle for this particular firm would be to produce 22 crops at a price point of 5, where a price point was recovered from the market. And if we also observe our output produced by this individual firm of 22 is precisely half of the overall market output of 44, given that an individual firm produces proportional to the amount of firms in the market, particularly that when they face similar production and cost constraints, which we would expect typically in a perfectly competitive market. So with that said, this sets us up for our next video in which we'll examine short-run profits and long-run profits in a perfectly competitive market by examining changes in equilibrium given introduction and exit of firms in the marketplace.